Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live show today. This is day 2 of our Intermodal Summit, and we're just going to give it just a few more seconds just to make sure everybody who's clicked the attend button joins us today. But we have a jam-packed conversation today based around a little bit more about what we talked about last week, and we had a ton of great feedback on that. So I cannot wait to dive a little bit deeper into the conversation around intermodal and introduce you to our guests today. We just want to make sure that we're giving everybody just a moment to join us, and then we will get started. I should say that we're going to be taking questions probably more towards the end of this discussion today. So if you have any questions that pop up while you are watching this live stream, make sure to put those in the comments and we will make sure to get to those as well. All right, well, we are 1 minute in, so I think it's about time to start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second LinkedIn Live in collaboration with IANA. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain and Blended, and I will be your host for today's live stream. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Larry Gross, President at Gross Transportation Consulting, Todd Tranowski, Vice President of Rail and Intermodal at FTR Transportation Intelligence, and Lars, CEO at Vespucci Maritime. Welcome, and thank you so much for being part of our live today.
Great to be with us.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
Great. So last week we talked all about why you should be utilizing intermodal transportation within your business and the benefits that that can bring, from greater efficiency and agility to reduced cost and an easy way to tackle sustainability goals. It was a great introduction to the world of intermodal. And today we're going to dive a little bit deeper, taking a closer look at some of the trends and insights that we're seeing in the industry right now. And it's a time of ongoing disruption and of evolution as supply chain as a whole looks to things like digitization and new technology to help drive us into the future. And intermodal really sits at the cross section of industries, impacting and tackling a wealth of challenges from rail to maritime. So taking the time to study the insights happening in intermodal right now is really very important. So let's start by getting a snapshot of what's happening across the industry and what you're all seeing from your perspectives. So Todd, what are you seeing from a rail perspective?
Well, from the rail perspective, it's really just continuation of the disruptions that we've seen really ever since the end of the pandemic, ever since things ramped up in September, October of 2020. We've never really gotten caught up fully in terms of being able to move the traffic that's out there. If you look at intermodal volumes, recently or in the second half of 2021, you could almost, without accounting for holidays, you can take your ruler and draw a line across it and pretty much get the volume number. That's not normal. That's not demand driven. That's because that's all the system can handle. That's all the volume that can fit through the pipe at any given time. And you've all heard the story, seen the congestion. There's inland rail terminal congestion. There's congestion at the ports, and it limits how much can flow through that pipe. And the railroads are still dealing with it as we head toward, the end of the year. We head towards sort of the traditional historic peak season. The railroads are still, constrained in terms of how much volume they can move. They still don't have all of the resources, particularly around crews, particularly around operating personnel, to be able to efficiently move the goods across their network. And then once it gets to the end, once it gets to the inland terminal, you have other issues. You have space to ground terminals that they're running out of. You have a lack of chassis at the inland terminal. So it's all across the supply chain. But for rail, it's really the same issues we've been dealing with for much of the last 2 years.
Yeah, and there's just not a lot of, we need some relief to sort of get back on track, pardon the pun. All right, Lars, over to you for maritime. Give us your perspective on what's happening there.
Yeah, on the maritime, let me present with you with two different narratives here, because the easiest thing in the world would be to sit here and say exactly the same thing as everybody in the maritime has said for the last 2 years. Everything is hopelessly congested. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. But we've got into a point, especially over the last few months, where that is no longer true. For anybody that moves on ocean, yeah, there is still congestion. There are still crazily poor reliability, still fantastically high freight rates. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. If you look at, for example, how many ships are tied up in congestion now versus the beginning of the year, there has been meaningful progress. It is still bad, absolutely, but there has been meaningful progress. Spot rates, which at least are the tip of the sword out there, not all cargo moves on spot, obviously, but it's the tip of the sword, it is coming down in a meaningful way. So on the maritime side, it is still challenged. Absolutely, yes. But we are on the journey now. We are on the journey towards restoration of, I wouldn't say pre-pandemic normality, but the new normality that we're going to emerge into. This is a journey that's not going to be over until way, way into 2023, maybe even only early 2024. But that journey has begun.
That's a little scary and exciting all at the same time, I think. Thank you so much for that, Lars. Larry, now over to you for the broker perspective.
Well, broker, or I'll say let's talk perhaps about the truck situation. When we look at what's happening on the truckload side, that's much more dominated by the domestic transportation situation than it is on the international side. Intermodal is much more of an international oriented mode. And we're definitely seeing some signs of, I'll say, a tapering on the domestic freight demand side. We see it most clearly in the spot market, which of course is the most volatile and the quickest reacting. Spot rates for dry van and reefer have fallen typically below where they were a year ago. And we do expect to see the contract rates, which are the more important rates from an intermodal perspective. We expect to see those go negative as well. They typically operate with about a 6-month lag versus spot, just because of the arithmetic and how long it takes for those rates to turn over. So when we put that in the intermodal context, we're still seeing, and I agree totally with what Todd said, we're seeing signs of constraints across the board. But on the domestic side, it's a little bit more interesting because perhaps we're starting to see some cracks in the demand situation as well. And maybe some of that is not just an operational constraint. We may be seeing now some of this truckload situation washing over into the domestic intermodal.
Yeah, and somebody had asked me about, the effect of weaker demand, and I was kind of like, well, I think it's going to give us some relief, or some of the relief that we've needed to really, like I said earlier in part of the pun, get us back on track. Lars, what do you think about that?
Well, yes and no. Obviously, if we get weaker demand, what you're going to see very rapidly is a sharp drop in the ocean volumes.
Mhm.
Because weaker demand would cascade immediately into overshooting on the inventories. Not only because people are not buying stuff, but because that will also help reduce some of the delays in the supply chain. You still have a supply chain which, if you look at Asia to US, has a delay compared to pre-pandemic levels of a month and a half.
Wow.
And every day you shorten that leads to more goods coming into the inventories. So a slowing demand scenario will lead to a massive overshoot on inventories and a sharp drop in demand.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to give a shout out on my personal LinkedIn. We've got Mohammed over there. And again, for anybody who has questions, make sure to put it in the comments because we'll definitely get to those. But I think it's safe to say that there's just a lot going on. And when we take a step back and reflect on all of this and everything else that's happening in the market, what patterns are really standing out? What are the biggest trends that you are seeing? Larry?
Well, I think from a demand standpoint, when we do get that reset that you referenced, and I agree with you, the system cannot dig its way out of its current situation without getting a break in volume. Now, what's going to happen, I think, is when this volume break does happen and the system gets a chance to reset, then you're going to see a lot more fluid operations, which is both a blessing as well as a potential problem, because you're going to all of a sudden get much more rapid asset turns at the same time that maybe demand is shrinking, and so you could get into a real overcapacity situation. I think that's true on the intermodal side. It's also potentially, and Lars, I guess, would have an opinion. It could also be true on the maritime side, that all of these assets that are tied up are going to get suddenly freed up, and capacity is going to be created out of thin air. And so the dynamic, when it does change, I think people are going to be surprised at how quickly it changes.
Well, and I've been seeing just on Lars's side is that the ocean carriers are making a lot of investment into new vessels and also creating capacity. So Lars, what's your thoughts on what Larry said and what I'm talking about as far as the investment from the steamship line perspective?
I mean, the steamship lines are investing in vessels, but that's the least of the market's worries, at least for the next 12 months. Sure, the vessels will be delivered. Sure, they're going to get too much, but I see that more as the normal cyclicality you always have in the market. What I see is and this is not a risk, this is a domino. It's a domino that is going to fall. Because when you contract the supply chain, much to Larry's point as well, if we go back to normality, that will mean that 2 months of additional flow of cargo suddenly turns into empty containers. If I look purely on the Asia to North American trade, 2 months worth of cargo, that's roughly 4 million TEU. That will mean if you get the supply chain back to normal, you get a literal pile of 4 million TEU of empties in North America. And mind you, this is on top of your normal flow, which means you will not have the vessel capacity to move it out. So the real question here is, do you have enough space in all of your depots and terminals in North America to host a pile of 4 million TEU? The answer to that is no. So we are going to reach a bump in the road until that gets cleared out as well. And that's already beginning to manifest itself with shippers that do have challenges in returning empty equipment. And we are only in the beginning of this effect.
Yeah, and we've heard of shippers actually dumping those containers in front of people's, in their parking lots, I think, because they're not taking these empties back. And so if this is only the beginning, I can only imagine what we're in for as an industry. And so Todd, you are, nodding your head all over the place with what Larry's saying, what Lars is saying. I want to bring you into the conversation here. Talk to us about the patterns and your thoughts on this.
Well, I agree with Larry that when it changes, it's going to change quick. Because if you look at retail inventories, particularly when you pull out automotive, which has its own sort of set of supply chain challenges, retail inventories, excluding automotive, are already well above pre-pandemic trend. So if you get a slackening of demand, those inventories build a lot quicker than I think people are building in. Now, it will help rail service. It will absolutely help the railroads, get out of their congestion issues. But the analogy I use is that's like losing weight by getting food poisoning. You really, you like the weight loss, but you prefer another way of doing it. And I think that's where things, yes, they're going to rebalance. They're going to rebalance quickly, but it's not the way anybody wants to get to a balanced supply chain by seeing slackening demand, by seeing a long or severe recession. I think any of those things, and we don't see those on the horizon. That said, I think there are some trends that we're seeing out there that are going to stick around, that have started in this post-pandemic period that we're going to see continue. And the number one thing I think we're going to see continue is transloading. We've seen transloading really tick up over the last, call it 18 months, but really the last 6 to 12 months is where it's really sort of inflected higher. I think that will continue. I think that is something we're going to see continue to be a tailwind for domestic intermodal and a headwind for international as we go forward. I think folks like getting more goods in fewer shipments. DCs are better equipped to handle 53s. They already do it on the trailer side. They already do it on the truck side. So having a standard size piece of equipment works well. I think it adds some efficiency. So I think you're going to see continued pressure on transloading even once we rebalance ourselves, even once we rebalance the inventory situation.
So talk to me about transloading. What does transloading mean to you, and why is that so important?
Well, what transloading does is it takes that 40-foot container that lands at the port, and then it either puts it in a warehouse or cross docks it into a 53 at a warehouse or other facility near the ports. So it takes place, particularly in Southern California, this goes on a lot, where you'll dray a 40-foot container out to a nearby warehouse, a nearby facility, and you'll cross dock that freight. You'll put in the 53-foot container for inland movement, and that 40-foot container can then go back to the port and not wander inland and not have to wait for a load inland to get back to the ports to go back over to Asia. So that Lars and the maritime folks aren't waiting for that 40-foot container to complete its 6 or 8 week journey into inland America, be unloaded, be reloaded, and then get back to the port. It can shorten that cycle down significantly. and the 53-foot then moves inland.
Thank you for that explanation. I just ask because, sometimes we've got people in the audience that may or may not know what that means. I want to give a shout out to Andre. He's got some great comments over there on my personal LinkedIn, and Bruce has got some good comments here. And Julio, I see your question. We're going to save that till a little bit later. So with all of that in mind, what are your predictions for the rest of 2022? Lars, do you want to start us off?
Spot rates are going to continue on the path that they are on. If we were ever going to see a bump, now would be it, and we are still not seeing it. There's not a peak season as such. You have actually seen the amount of blank sailings gradually get lower and lower over this year. There's still a lot of blank sailings, but it's going lower, and that's also a trend that's going to continue. The really interesting thing, and that is already slowly beginning to creep up now, you do have trades like, for example, Asia to US West Coast, where spot rates are now firmly below a lot of the contract rates. This is going to lead to the usual dance where there will be a massive pressure from the shippers on the carriers to do something about those contracts. So a key theme here for the rest of the year, that is really going to be, is this different? The carriers have argued that over the last year, that a lot of the contracts that they made are new, they're different in nature, they're more enforceable. That's really going to stand its test here over the rest of the year.
It absolutely is, because I heard all sorts of mumblings around contract season at the beginning of 2022 and a variety of things that you really had to keep your eye on. Are there specific things within those contracts that people need to be keeping their eye on as far as new, Lars?
No, but some of the new elements that's been put in there, when I say new, of course, it has been tried on various forms before, but part of the new elements are these penalty schemes that are in penalties that goes both ways. So if the shipper doesn't deliver, there's a penalty. If the carrier doesn't deliver, there's obviously a penalty as well. So those are the ones that's really going to say, well, will they stand up to the pressure that they're going to come under now?
I think that's a good point. Larry, I want to move over to you. What are your predictions for the rest of 2022 in your world?
Well, I think from an intermodal perspective, that it's going to be certainly a muted peak season. Todd made mention of the fact that the system is kind of running flat out, so its ability to flex upward is very, very limited. Certainly, that's true on the international, the IPI side. Now, even if things just continue along the way they are, without any growth from month to month, you're still going to see some very significant year-over-year gains in the latter part of this year, because last year at this time was when IPI was choked off. So the year-over-year change is going to look very impressive, but it doesn't really signify any growth at the moment. It's more about what happened last year at this time. Now, on the domestic side, we're seeing strong growth in the private container fleets. That would be folks like J.B. Hunt or Schneider or FedEx or Amazon or Walmart. We're all getting a lot of equipment in there, and their loads are going up. But at the same time, we're seeing weakness on the rail container side and TOFC. So that the actual net in terms of total domestic intermodal activity, the gains are very modest, because those two weak sectors are offsetting the private. Again, I think we're going to see very muted gains in the fourth quarter because demand is softening, and a lot of that volume has already been upstream.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And then, Todd, I want you to get out your crystal ball. I should have told you to bring a prop. Tell us what you think that it's going to look like in rail over the next year or two.
Well, I mean, in rail, I think for the next couple of quarters, it's going to be very much a status quo. I don't think you're going to see any sort of rail service improvement until at least the second quarter of 2023. And so because you're not going to see service improvement, it limits that ability of the system to flex up. It limits the ability of the system to take any more volume, whether it's an intermodal or whether it's in carload, because there just aren't the operating personnel out there to deal with it. So I think until you get to the back half of next year, there's really isn't a whole lot of impetus for growth. And then you get into a question at that point of, will there be shippers, particularly intermodal shippers or carload manifest shippers, that have optionality will they be willing to trust the railroads? Will they be willing to actually bring their freight back? We've heard a lot on railroad earnings calls about a pivot to growth and growing volumes. You need to have a willing shipper willing to put that freight on the rails. And I worry that when we get to that second half, once as an industry, once the railroads have added people back and been able to improve their service levels, are shippers actually going to be willing to trust their freight to the railroad? Or particularly with active truck utilization coming off, if folks have an option, do they choose to move it by truck? If you look at our intermodal competitive index, it's pretty neutral out through the next year, which says that intermodal is not overly positively competitive with truckload, that they're about in balance. It's a pretty neutral market. And so if you're a shipper, time is money. If you want to know you can get there, I could see shippers choosing truck over rail, even once the railroads get their service back. I think it's going to take the railroads longer than normal to regain the market share they've lost over the last few years.
So interesting. And thank you for sharing that. We've got a couple of other questions from Andrea and Julio as well. Just wanted to let you know I see them, and we're going to get to them a little bit later. But obviously a lot, if not all of these current trends and predictions for the future that we've talked about so far have been influenced either directly or indirectly by the pandemic. I mean, how can they not, right? So what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned or that you think shippers should have learned from the pandemic? Lars, I'm going to start with you.
I think one of the key issues to take away from the pandemic is this was the first time, I was about to say almost in the history of container shipping, where we reached that point where physically there was not enough vessel capacity. Not because we didn't have enough vessels, but because they were tied up in all these bottlenecks. But the bottom line is there was not enough vessel capacity, which caused freight rates to skyrocket. I mean, we've all seen some of these numbers, 500% up, 1,000% up. And if you were a shipper, this was a shock to the system. Let me be slightly controversial here and say nobody should really have been surprised, because this is the norm in the older, more established parts of shipping. Nobody bats an eyelid in the oil tanker business if suddenly freight rates there go up by a factor of 10. Doesn't happen every year, it doesn't happen every other year, but it does happen regularly. The reason for that is you have to make a choice. Either you have perpetual massive overcapacity, somebody needs to pay for that, or you have the right amount of vessel capacity to handle normal fluctuations, but then you don't have a massive buffer sitting idle. And if you don't have a massive buffer sitting idle, it doesn't take much of a shock to the system, then you run out of capacity. For 10 years, all we've talked about at all these different shipping conferences is the problem with vessel overcapacity, and why that is nobody could make any money. The carriers spent 10 years gradually absorbing that overcapacity. On the eve of the pandemic, we had the lowest order book for many, many, many years. That was seen as a healthy sign. And basically it is, because then you don't have a lot of excess capacity. Nobody wants to pay for that. But that means when you get a shock to the system, you're going to have a temporary period of insufficient capacity. And I actually do have it here. I did have the crystal ball.
Thank you.
On that part, the way I see this one is, this is not the last time we see this. I'm not predicting you're going to see rates go up 10x in 2024 or 25. But what I'm saying is shippers should prepare that container shipping is no longer the younger brother of shipping. It has grown into adulthood as well. And like the other shipping sectors, we should no longer be surprised if at irregular intervals, suddenly see freight rates shoot up 5 or 10x for a limited period, basically because nobody wants to pay for overcapacity.
So I think this is a good time to bring in Julio's question. Lars, why freight rate internationally will not find again equilibrium on pre-pandemic levels? The reason why I'm asking this now is because it has everything to do with what you just said. So I want to give you a chance to answer that.
The very simplistic version is because pre-pandemic, for decades before the pandemic, the liner shipping industry was a loss-making industry. You can, of course, twist the numbers in many different ways, but that is the long and short of it. Is that because the owners of the carriers were stupid to just give up money away for 20 years? I don't subscribe to that theory. The way I see this is, this was an extremely rapidly growing industry for basically 3 decades. The only way to stay in that game was to constantly find more capital to grow rapidly to stay in the game. about a decade ago, that market growth normalized. Then it was about how do you then become profitable? If we didn't have the pandemic, let's just play what if. What we were poised for by the beginning of 2020 was a cyclical upturn. We had an extremely low order book. We had decent demand growth. You would have seen freight rates go up higher. You had an industry that had reached a level of consolidation that finally allowed them to sustainably become profitable. And I know this is probably going to stir the anger with a large amount of shippers out there that feel that freight rates have been absolutely extortionate over the last 2 years. I'm not saying that these are the right rate levels either, but reality is, even without the pandemic, rates would have gone up. They would have gone up significantly. I would not have been surprised, even in the absence of the pandemic, that you would now have a rate level that was potentially twice what it was before the pandemic, simply because the industry had reached a point where it had matured. It was no longer an option for the carriers to perpetually lose money for their shareholders.
Wow, so interesting. It's not something that I had heard of previously, but I appreciate you for sharing. Now, I want to go to Larry about what changes the pandemic has inspired, or that you've seen has inspired within your customers' businesses.
Well, I think that what the pandemic and this resulting disruption has caused is an examination of some long-held beliefs, and those would include things like just-in-time inventory, as opposed to just-in-case inventory. We have operated under a lean system, trying to squeeze all of the excess capacity out, get as efficient as possible. And as Lars, I think, correctly stated, nobody wants to pay for surge capacity. It's very expensive. But what the BCOs have found is that the cost of stockouts of when you don't have the product on the shelf is huge compared to the cost of carrying some additional inventory. Now, these changes in the supply chain that I'm talking about, these are not changes that occur rapidly. And I'm of the belief that coming out of the pandemic, we have what's called the great dispersal. And that's dispersal of freight on three dimensions. One is where it's coming from, the second is where it's moving to, and the third is when it's moving. And all of those things are changing slowly but inexorably as a result of coming out of the pandemic. We're seeing, for instance, a pivot away from China, not just because of the pandemic, but because of all the other things that are going on, geopolitical issues and such, towards other sourcing, whether it's other overseas sources or nearshoring. And these things don't happen overnight. But certainly one of the big changes I think that's occurring is a tapering down of the offshoring, and maybe an end to the days when import TEUs are growing faster than the goods portion of GDP. Jobs won't be flowing overseas anymore. They'll just be staying where they are.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and definitely something that supply chain professionals are thinking about, right? I'm going to be talking, I think, in 2 weeks' time about how Apple is now moving some of their manufacturing again. They already moved it to India. Now they're looking at Vietnam. Definitely not nearshoring, but also taking a look at different places to be able to manufacture. So last week we talked about how the pandemic has shone a light on the industry's need for agility, but at the same time, its need to ensure reliable robustness, particularly with ever-changing consumer demand and market volatility. So let's talk a little bit more about the infrastructure of intermodal and how it can help with that. Lars, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at it from the ocean carrier perspective, I will try for the second time here to incur the wrath of a lot of the shippers out there. Because what I would also venture, if I look at this, especially from a US perspective, so I'm going to stress that one. I could use a European import perspective too. The supply chains on the ocean side have been phenomenally robust given what we have been through. Sure, there has been an unprecedented amount of blank sailings, but all things considered, the carriers have been able to throw a lot more capacity in. You have seen the influx of a lot of new container carriers. to add additional capacity into the system. Nothing is running on time, which, by the way, isn't really controlled by the carriers. This is where ports and intermodal behind comes into it. But from that perspective, despite all the turmoil, the carriers have moved historical volumes of cargo through those pipelines. The reason why I said this was a specific US and European view is that is not what you find if you go to certain places in Africa, to certain places in the Pacific, certain places in intra-Asia, because this robustness of the supply chain into North America and into Europe, to some degree, has come at a cost of degrading the supply chain robustness to other places in the world where they have a lower capability to pay high freight rates.
Absolutely. Now, Todd, I want to go over to you for this infrastructure question. What are you seeing, and what's kind of on the horizon? I mean, everybody, when they think about intermodal, they think about the infrastructure, right? So talk to us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is about infrastructure, but it's also about fluidity. And I think that the big, the big limiter is not necessarily locomotives or track capacity. There aren't a whole lot of steel in the ground bottlenecks anymore for the rail system. It's a matter of having the people, having the operating employees on the ground to be able to actually move the freight, move the trains, move the locomotives across the system, to be able to have those people. Trains don't run themselves. You need an engineer and a conductor to be able to do that. There are certainly some things from an infrastructure perspective that the carriers can do at their terminals. Quicker in gates, quicker out gates, making it easier for the trucker to move through the facility. Certainly there's technology that can be leveraged around that to help the trucker know before he gets to the port or the terminal, where am I going for that box? Where is it? Is it on wheels, or do I have to get a flip? What does that all look like, so that truckers can be as efficient as possible when they're on the terminal? That's really where the infrastructure could catch up, to be able to do that, to be able to put technology and information in the driver's hand, in the dray driver's hand, to be able to be more efficient and move more boxes through the terminals quicker. It's not really we have a double track bottleneck in Arizona we need to solve. Those have all been solved by now. It really is that first mile, last mile in the terminals. How do we drive efficiency to get people to get throughput through those terminals, to be able to move as many boxes as we can? Because most of the terminals, particularly when we're talking about Chicago and places like that, they're landlocked. There isn't room to expand the physical footprint. You've got airports, you've got toll roads, you've got residential neighborhoods. So you have to get more efficient from a technology perspective in order to get more throughput through a lot of those facilities.
I'm so glad you mentioned technology, because I think technology is going to bring everybody together. And what we're talking about is really collaboration. There needs to be collaboration in order for this to work. And I think technology can also bring everybody together. And I say this way too much, but collaboration really is the future of business. But, infrastructure as it stands and how it could evolve in the future really is subject to a lot of external forces that potentially could have a big impact on the industry. There's a big discussion happening at the moment with FMC commissioners asking for rail regulators to reject the proposed KCS merger. They're arguing that losing intermodal market share to Canada could negatively impact the U.S. supply chain. What are your thoughts on this? What's your perspective? Would the consolidation harm the U.S. intermodal industry and the various businesses involved, Larry?
I absolutely don't think so. In fact, I think from a port flow viewpoint, the CPKCS is essentially irrelevant. Certainly with regard to Canadian ports, I just don't see the overlap there. Where I do think is, regardless of whether it was Canadian National or Canadian Pacific or that ended up acquiring KCS, either of them would have been a good candidate. But having a single line move across the border is going to be an intermodal plus versus having an interchange that needs to occur at the border. Intermodal always works better when a single entity is controlling the flow all the way from origin to destination. If we look at that U.S. to Mexico domestic intermodal market, it has not been a strong performer up till now. And I think the big reason for that is because you've had more than one railroad associated with it. So I think there's a real opportunity to make some progress in that lane with regard to single line service. And as well, probably put some competitive pressure on the other players in there to up their game as well.
Well, so that kind of brings me to my next question. Would the merger negatively impact our ability to offer competitive and efficient supply chain solutions? Todd, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would at all. I don't think it would negatively affect the U.S. at all. And from an intermodal perspective, I think it's a good thing. I think competition's a good thing. It allows shippers to have alternatives. It allows shippers to be able to have choices to get their goods to market. And it quite frankly, it forces the Western railroads to up their game. It forces the Western railroads to not just sit on their franchises off the West Coast. They're going to have to prove that they can do it. They're going to have another option there because you can bring things through Vancouver and get single line into Chicago. You can do that today. You can use Lázaro Cárdenas to get further north than you can today. Most Mexican intermodal traffic today, the majority of it is intra-Mexico. You haven't really been able to have an appreciable amount of volume come into Lázaro and come into places like Houston, places like Dallas, Atlanta, growing markets across the South. You really haven't seen that. It gives shippers that option. It gives shippers that pressure relief valve. Obviously, the congestion issues in LA Long Beach were well documented over the last year. Is Lázaro going to be somebody's main port? Probably not, but it does give them that pressure relief valve. It does give them that alternative. And if you can single line it all the way into the Midwest, all the way deeper into the U.S., that certainly provides an additional alternative, provides additional competition in there to move goods, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, and as long as they have time to make those changes too, right? Because making changes while goods are on the water, Lars knows this, is very difficult, time-consuming, costly, and there's a lot of documentation with it. But I think you're right. I think options are what supply chain professionals need when they're looking at their supply chains and looking at the deadlines that they have to hit for their customers and what makes the most sense for them. I think the other thing too is they're looking at different locations for their warehousing. And this will also give them options of getting their products there quicker. Now, I already mentioned collaboration. And sometimes, in these discussions, we say there's an inability to work towards an effective solution, but collaboration could really be the solution for that. And I think the pandemic has made that even clearer, but it's a mindset that still isn't being embraced by plenty of people and organizations across supply chain. We don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I think it's important to talk about. So Lars, talk to us about maybe the lack of or interagencies cooperation. How is this hindering the success of the industry, and what can we do to help or improve things?
Yeah, there are two elements to it. One thing is what can we achieve, and this is where this was also an issue before the pandemic. All the different stakeholders and reality should be exchanging detailed operational information. The carriers, the ports, the railroads, the truckers, everybody. You can then posit if everybody shares the information, that would require the same informational standards. It will require systems. We're not quite there yet. But let me point out something else that I think is missing from this whole debate, because very often it is seen as this panacea. If only everybody shared information, we could avoid a lot of these bottlenecks. Again, let me do a counterfactual here. Let's say, just for sake of argument, all of this was in place by summer 2021. All of it, let's say it was in place. We have perfect vision for everybody. I clearly remember early summer 2021, I sat down and looked at the carriers' plans for putting more capacity into Trans-Pacific, into the West Coast. And already at that time said, look, this is going to create massive congestion issues because they were ramping up dramatically on capacity at a point where ports were already stretched. Now ask yourself, if you had perfect foresight back then, you would have come to the same thing. You would come to the conclusion you should not put all these ships in. What would you then have had the carriers do? Again, context. Already in summer 2021, spot rates were exceedingly high. Not as high as they then went, but they were extremely high. Carriers were already at that time accused of deliberately not putting enough capacity into the market to manipulate rates to go higher. Would the carriers in that situation have been able to go to the market and say, look at the math here, look at the scoreboard. We're going to reduce capacity in the midst of the wildest boom ever because we want to prevent congestion 4 months down the line? I think everybody already knows the answer to that question. That would be completely impossible to do. So whilst I certainly agree, sharing information needs to be done at a much more detailed and operational level because there are improvements. It is not a panacea that will fix everything.
So how do we then improve it? Like, what are some of the solutions that we can look at?
Part of the solutions is, and again, this is where I become slightly hypothetical because this is not a US issue, it is a global issue. It's about finding, let's just call it a platform for want of a better word, where ideally you would have the information all the way from a purchase order is being placed until the final mile where that cargo is being delivered. That will allow you to predict fairly well all the way through the supply chain, months in advance, where are you going to see bottlenecks? It might be lack of port infrastructure, it might be not enough trucks, it might not be not enough rails. The point is not just to point fingers and say we're going to have an issue, but if you can predict this, say 2 or 3 months in advance, you can take action. You can either say, I'm going to reroute it, I'm going to go somewhere else, or you might say, well, that's not a rerouting option, then I'm going to ship my cargo either earlier or later, depending on what matches. It's about smoothing out the flows. That is what this will allow you to do.
Great. Thank you for that. And Andre and George on the other stream that I'm looking at over here are having a good conversation about AI and predictive technology. And, with all that being said, let's piggyback on what you've talking about, because one of the key things I think is data, right? Because if you have the right technology and the proactive approach that you're talking about, you can create visibility and collect the information and insights needed to build a stronger industry together. So let's talk about some of the data initiatives happening right now. Larry, do you want to start us off, and then I'll go to Todd?
Well, I can't really speak with any specifics with regard to data. But if you would just indulge me for a minute, Sarah,
Sure.
I want to go back to what Lars was saying. And I agree with him that there's a limit to what the value is of having visibility. Well, and how you asked how we can change things. And one of the ways that we change behavior is with incentives. And there is, I think, quite a bit of situations occurring right now in the entire intermodal supply chain where the folks that are generating the expenses, generating the costs, are not the same ones that are paying. And so, for instance, if we have a situation right now where a trucker, a drayman, is trying to return an empty to the port of New York, there's no more room for empties, as Lars correctly pointed out earlier. Now the trucker is having to sit on the empty, is potentially even storing it, paying detention and demurrage, and it's not the trucker's fault that they can't return it. It's somebody else's fault. And the problem is that the incentives are not properly in place to assess the expense against the persons or the entities that are causing it. And so I think if there's a role for regulation, it's the FMC can't solve the congestion process. But what they could, it's congestion problem. But what they can do is help ensure that the expenses are being properly allocated to the people that are causing the expense. And I think that that's a conversation very, very much worth having.
Absolutely. And Glorimar does agree with you on that, is because the inefficiency that's happening right now are frustrating truckers, shippers, and, logistics companies, everybody sort of across the board. And, we've got to find a solution for that. Now, Todd, you were nodding your head. I think you want to jump in here and talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah,
Thank you,
absolutely.
Larry.
Absolutely. On the rail side, I think that there is more headroom in terms of visibility and transparency. Once it goes on the railroads, it goes into a bit of a black hole. Now, they've gotten better over the last few years, but it's still very much hit and miss in terms of how much visibility, how much transparency you have over that data. Now, part of that is because the carriers view that data as proprietary, as their own. And so that limits how much sharing can go on across the supply chain, but also to the shippers themselves, to the BCOs who actually own that cargo, own that container. If you haven't put GPS on your containers or your rail cars, you don't really know where it is at any given point in time. And so then there are initiatives in the industry, whether it's Rail Pulse or whether it's Rail State. There's some good things going on to try and bring additional visibility and transparency to shippers. But right now, it goes on the railroad, and if it's sitting between AEI readers, you may not know where it is, and it may sit there for days at a time, and that's unacceptable to shippers, particularly when we live in an era where if I order from Pizza Hut, I know where that pizza is, cradle to grave, for that $10 pizza. How come freight shippers with their hundreds of thousands of dollars of freight weather don't know where their box is at any given point in time? And that's where the railroads really need to up their game in terms of transparency and visibility. I think they're on the rail side, there's plenty of additional room to run.
Well, I mean, if you think about Uber, right, you can watch your driver and see where he is and when he's going to get to you and all that kind of thing. And I think that's what we're really used to as on the consumer side. And we really want, the technology and supply chain to catch up to that, because we know how possible that is. Now, Todd, I want to bring
can I just make one comment on that one?
Please.
Because it is a good comparison, but also shows where the comparison breaks down. Because I can see where the pizza delivery guy is, and that is great. That also means if I can see suddenly the pizza is not moving, I can call the pizza joint because they're responsible. If we get all of this data, you get, for example, now Hapag-Lloyd is putting GPS on all their dry containers. Sure, I can see now my container is just sitting there. What I cannot see from the data is who is responsible. Why is it there? Is it the trucker? Is it the rail company? Is it the yard? Is it the carrier? The issue here is getting all the data. Yes, that is a prerequisite for improving, but it is not enough. There is still too much confusion in the supply chain about who is actually responsible for doing what.
That is a really good point. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's true, right? There's so many different players on a shipment. And so who do you pick up and call, right? With the pizza delivery, you can pick up and call that phone number. But if it's 12 o'clock at night and you're working with a freight forwarder and they're not working 24/7, you're sitting there watching your box sit there.
Not only that, but I mean, this also came to a head already last year, and you're seeing increasing cases brought before the FMC in relation to who is responsible for detention and demurrage.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be an indisputable fact that this is when the container finally made it in, but it is definitely disputable who is responsible for the delay. You can see the delay, you can measure the delay, but you cannot see immediately from the data who caused it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's kind of that conversation around sustainability. Who's going to pay for all of these different fuels that we want to use on ocean, on the steam, on the boats? But that's a conversation for another day. Now we do have to get to our questions from the audience. So Todd, I'm going to bring you back up because we have a question from Andrea. How long is it estimated the domestic chassis shortage might impact transloading operations during the transition or shift mentioned by you?
Well, I mean, chassis shortages, chassis tightness is not a new issue. It's something that's been around for a long time. You normally see it, at sort of the traditional pinch points, Memphis, Indianapolis, places like that. What you don't normally see is you see it all widespread at essentially almost every terminal. Now, what's going to solve that? Well, it's going to start by the easing of the supply chain. You're going to need everybody in the supply chain working together. You're going to need to turn boxes quicker. That means if you're a BCO, you can't sit on a box for 7 or 8 days at your facility because you don't have warehouse space. That's not what the chassis pool providers have modeled their fleets around. There's not going to be enough chassis so long as that continues. You have to get to a normalization to really see chassis, particularly good order chassis, free up. Because when it's sitting for 7 or 8 days at a DC, fleet owners, chassis pool owners rightly say, well, I'm not going to add to my fleet. I'm not going to expand the chassis fleet. I'm not going to build that church for Easter Sunday when fluidity is going to return and I'm going to have all these extra chassis floating around.
Right.
It's going to take everybody putting it together, even though shippers will tell you, if I'm willing to pay the per diem on that chassis, it's utilized. Even if it's just storing that box in my facility, if I'm willing to pay the per diem, it's utilized. Shippers are going to have to understand that that's all that does is takes capacity out of the system, and it makes it harder for them and everybody else to get the capacity they need and work our way out of some of the disruptions that we've seen over the last 2 years.
Thank you. Stay right there because I've got 2 more questions for you from the audience. And great question, Andrea. So Julio, Todd, transloading sounds magic in theory, but how will you manage customs or quality controls or BI standard ways of trade?
Well, in terms of customs, your customs process still handles at the port. Your customs process continues to happen at the port before that box ever leaves. So that 40-foot container still clears customs before it can ever leave the port, before those goods can even be moved out to a warehouse or a transloading facility. So that doesn't really change. Now, you have to figure out how to get visibility at the pallet level, at the SKU level, to be able to mix and match those cargoes and know exactly what freight is in that 53 once you break the 40 down. Once you start commingling freight in that 53, you have to have some way to understand which freight is in that 53. But in terms of customs, the customs process happens at the port before that box ever moves into the warehouse, into the transloading process.
Yeah, you're not moving it in bond across the country. You're doing it closer to the port of entry. So question from Greg, what is rail doing to address increasing dwell times at the ports? Can anything be done, or is this a long COVID effect that will just have to work itself out long term?
Well, in terms of, railroads are trying to hire. They are trying to hire the people they need to move freight. Now, they have not been very successful at that. If you look at the number of operating personnel on the railroads since October of 2020 through June, it hasn't moved a whole lot. Through July, in fact, it hasn't moved a whole lot. It stayed a pretty flat number, which, again, one of those numbers where if you take your ruler and draw across, you can pretty well figure out what the number is. That's not normal. The railroads have not been able to hire people, and it's going to take them being able to hire people back to be able to move goods more efficiently off the ports and through the supply chain. In terms of what they can do, the carriers need to find a way to recruit and retain their employees. There are anecdotal reports out there of several carriers having conductor classes that were full, and then within 2 weeks of graduation, the retention rate's in the single digits. There's going to be very hard to get ahead of it that way. It's going to be very hard to meaningfully improve service, particularly, as I said, if your overall number is staying flat, that means you're hiring people just as quickly as people are leaving. And so you're actually having productivity drag as you do that, because you're replacing higher senior veteran crews with less seasoned, less experienced crews that don't know how to work every industry on the line, don't know how to efficiently move on the ground when they're doing flat switching. And so you have productivity issues, first mile, last mile issues in terms of, serving those last shippers on the line, serving the end of those facilities, because they're not moving as efficiently on the ground. And so the railroads, they need to hire more people that are working at it. History says they will get it figured out eventually. The question, of course, is when.
How long? Yeah. How long? I knew you were going to say that. Well, thank you for those questions. And thank you, Todd. This one I'm going to send over to you, Larry. The need for sustainable transportation vehicles for company offsetting carbon credits need to prove their supply chain is maintaining zero carbon emissions. How is that improving?
Well, intermodal is generally regarded as a superior mode in terms of its emissions, and the perhaps a good rule of thumb is about half the emissions for an intermodal move versus over the road. I think there are certainly calculation engines that the railroads put out in terms of what their emissions are. Individual shippers, I think, are conducting their own programs. There's plenty of information out there. Intermodal is not a panacea. It's just one of the tools in the toolbox for helping reduce those emissions.
Absolutely. And I think, it does help with a lot of the ESG goals that a lot of companies have. And we talked about that actually on day one of the Intermodal Summit last week. So if you wanted to go and check that out, it's over on the Let's Talk Supply Chain YouTube page. If you missed it, we did answer some of that question last week as well. Lars, I have a question from Kushal. Why sudden increase in transit time post-pandemic? Here talking about the air shipment movement. So we're going from maritime to air, but I figured we could answer this question, right, Lars?
Oh, air is not really my specialty to the best of my knowledge. No, I'm not even going to venture a view on the airport. Sorry about that one.
No, that's totally fine. So Kushal, you could probably message me and I can help you out by finding an answer for that, unless Larry or Todd wanted to answer that one.
Not at all.
No? Okay. Wanted to ask that. All right. As we wind down this conversation, I do want to ask each one of you to provide one key takeaway that the audience should go away from the live stream today, either thinking about, or maybe there's an action item that they should be putting into practice or think about putting into practice. So I'm going to start with you, Larry. What should the audience walk away from this discussion with?
I think that the main issue that the audience needs to be thinking about is how quickly change can occur, and to have their plans in place for when conditions begin to change rapidly. I think we're on the cusp of an inflection point right now, going back towards some hopefully a little bit more normal situation. But we don't know what the next black swan event is going to be, but they seem to be occurring with greater frequency. So what they need to be thinking about is agility and contingencies and maintaining flexibility in their supply chain to be able to respond to the unforeseeable.
As the Girl Guides say, be prepared. Todd, you're next. What's one key takeaway everybody should walk away from?
The key takeaway is to have diversity in your supply chain. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. To Larry's point, be flexible. Don't have all of your volume going through one port of entry or all on one railroad. Be able to have alternatives so that when things happen, whether they're black swan events or whether they're congestion or whether they're disruptions in your own manufacturing operations, you have options. You have an ability to go somewhere else if it's not working. Early in the pandemic, LA Long Beach was really congested. Now it's freed up substantially, but New York, New Jersey, Savannah are having issues. How do you set up your supply chain so that you have a little bit of diversity and you have a little bit of diversification so that you can move around and keep your overall supply chain as fluid as possible?
Absolutely. And last but absolutely not least, Lars, give us your one key takeaway.
I will be annoying and come with two. The one being just building on what Todd and Larry said, not just the resilience, but also make sure you as a shipper know how important the different parts of your cargo is, because for some parts of your cargo, you absolutely want that resilience and agility. For other parts of your cargo, you might be perfectly comfortable with that one potentially being delayed for God knows how long. So make sure you know your priorities on the different parts of cargo. The last part I want to bring up is, of all the many different disruptions we've been hit by the last 2.5 years, there is one particularly nasty one where we have been extremely lucky we have not been hit. That is a major cyber attack. The way I see that one is that is more down to luck than anything else. Make absolutely sure you are prepared for that.
That is such a great point. And we didn't talk about that today, but we could definitely do a whole one of these on that. So that has definitely given us a lot to think about. Intermodal is a bit of a complex beast, but our panelists have really taken us behind the scenes today and given us a real insight into the challenges, the trends, and the future of the industry. And if today's and last week's LinkedIn Lives have sparked your appetite and you're keen to dive deeper, then make sure you register for the IANA International Expo 12th to the 14th of September in Long Beach, California. It's going to have absolutely everything you need to better understand intermodal and the role it could play within your business. Whether you're looking to find out more about the transloading trend or how to make your first and last mile strategies a success, over 80 companies and a host of professional speakers will be available to share how they're supporting the growth of intermodal and how they can help you too. And of course, I'll also be there bringing you the behind the scenes scoop as I interview exhibitors and attendees. It's going to be an incredible few days and a great way to throw yourself back into in-person events. I'm personally super excited, so I hope to see you there. A big thank you to Larry, Todd, and Lars, and of course, Ayanna, for making this live stream happen. If you'd like to find out more, register for Expo, head over to intermodal.org. And of course, thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it and that it's provided some essential information and inspiration on the key trends and insights that you need to be thinking about when it comes to intermodal in your business. Please do reach out to any one of us on social media if you have any questions or anything else you'd like to share. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you all again soon.